media platform. And of course, disinformation campaigns and cyber militias have actually been employed by these governments, and of course leading to internet shutdowns and the like. I came up with a number of key important takeaways, quotes from yesterday's sessions, and I was particularly impressed by Tess, who actually said that youth get to vote, but leaders get the democracy. I thought that was profound. And again, President Chisano said that power concedes nothing without a demand. And I thought these are very important takeaways from yesterday's sessions. Again, I once again thank you and warmly invite you to today's session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nicodemus. That takes an awful lot of brain power to compress discussions from over 6 hours into that summary. For the next 40 or so minutes, 45 minutes, we will have, and this is in continuing with data-driven advocacy and evidence-based campaigning and so on, and research. We would like to hear about what the findings are regarding freedom in the world, specifically to Africa. And to help us do that is Tiseke Kasambala, who is Africa Director for Freedom House. Please welcome her to the stage and get ready to engage her on the findings she's going to present. This session is designed to be interactive, so please listen and pose questions where you deem fit. Tiseke, you're very welcome. Please welcome her. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. So, like my brother said, this session, I would really love it if we had as interactive a session as possible. We always like to get questions that interrogate the methodology that we use in putting together this report. So please try and ask me the tough questions. If I can't answer them, I'll let you know. But it's always good for us to interrogate how we come about with this information so that we can improve for the next report that we release. So as per the introductions, my name is Tiseke Kasambala, and I'm the Africa Director at Freedom House. As Freedom House, for those of you who don't know who we are a not-for-profit organization that seeks to advance democracy, hold governments accountable to their people, promote respect for the rule of law, and ensure and guarantee the rights of citizens, including those who are most marginalized. We issue this report on an annual basis. It's our flagship report. And I just wanted to say that this one is the 50th anniversary since we started issuing these annual Freedom in the World reports. It's a report that includes scores and narrative assessments on political rights and civil liberties in 195 countries and 15 territories around the globe. This one, which is the 50th, basically covers developments in 2022 and provides a brief analysis of some of the long-term trends that we've seen over the past year in these countries and territories that I talked about. The methodology we use is derived in large measure from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948. So how do we go about making these assessments? What you need to know is that we focus on two fundamental areas. We focus on political rights, namely 3 categories: electoral processes, political pluralism, and participation and the functioning of government. We also look at civil liberties, where we look at 4 subcategories under the civil liberties category. The first one is freedom of expression and belief. We look at freedom of association and organizational rights. We look at the rule of law, and then personal autonomy and individual rights. And so those are the two areas that we really focus on. And in making these ratings, we base them on scores from 0 to 4 points each under each of the political rights indicators and the civil liberties indicators. We use, I think for this report, we used over 120 analysts across all the territories that I'm speaking to, and then brought in more than 40 experts to interrogate the information that the analysts brought to us from the ground. The analysts relied on on-the-ground research, on civil society organization and NGO reports, and they relied on press cuttings and other desktop documents that they were able to use to confirm their findings. We then brought them into a room and brought in outside external experts from across the globe, region by region, to interrogate those findings. We also bring in our own staff who are experts in their fields. So that's essentially the methodology that we use to put together this report. What are our global findings for 2022? I think it's important for me to anchor the findings on Africa in terms of the state of democracy in Africa in what we've seen across the globe. This is the 17th year, according to our Freedom in the World report, that we saw democratic regression across the globe. It's not a good thing, but at the same time, as we saw that regression, we also saw that the struggle for democracy may actually be approaching a turning point, because the gap between the number of countries that registered overall improvements in political rights and civil liberties and those that showed a decline for 2022 was the narrowest we have seen it in these 17 years of regression. So I think that's an important factor, that maybe we're actually turning the corner. We also saw that a lot of countries that we designated as free, because we have a status, we designate our countries as free, partly free, and not free. In 2022, most countries that we designated as free resisted a further decline and did not slide into the partly free or not free status or indices. But those that were partly free and not free, mostly, especially those that were in the partly free category, slid. Some of them slid into the not free category, and a lot of them kind of held their ground in being partly free. The most serious setbacks that we identified in terms of freedom and democracy were the results of war, coups, and attacks on democratic institutions by illiberal incumbents. So when we look at the tally of the 195 countries and territories, 34 countries made improvements. Those with declines were 35, which is the smallest that we've recorded since this negative trend began 17 years ago. So again, we're looking at some positive movement. And the gains that were driven by more competitive elections, we saw gains that were actually driven by competitive elections and a rollback of what we would say are pandemic-related restrictions, which in the past 2 years, 2020, 2021, had disproportionately affected the rights to freedom of assembly and freedom of movement. So I think when you look at the past 50 years of freedom in the world, we have an opportunity to reflect globally on the challenges and achievements of democracy in the past 5 decades. And what we have seen has always been the most significant challenge in terms of the widespread assaults on civil liberties that has been used and that should be used to hold governments to account. And most notably related to that is the right to freedom of expression. And of course, a lot of us have been talking about digital rights and how governments are now kind of clamping down on digital rights. So the right to freedom of expression has been key. Quickly now zoning into the continent and into Africa and our findings for 2022. Africa is one of the continents that saw the most dramatic score declines and also improvements in the areas of political rights and civil liberties in 2022. And most of these stemmed, as our leaders and elders have been referring to over and over again, changes of leadership which was a positive thing through democratic elections, but also changes of leadership through authoritarian power grabs. And that was also a key kind of driver of the decline that we saw in some of the countries that I'll kind of provide examples about. Then, of course, we also had the chronic issue of corruption and misgovernance, which combined with the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and of course what we saw in the war in Ukraine, which affected, grain supplies, it made our countries on the continent more vulnerable to irregular seizures of power by military or executive officials. But again, on the positive side, despite these threats, a number of countries were able to hold relatively free and fair elections, which ushered in new governments and reinforced democratic institutions. So, we have this stark contrast between governments in the region consolidating power via illiberal means, and we have those that manage to uphold smooth transitions of power through free and fair elections in 2022. Where did we see the declines, the notable declines, and then notable improvements, and where there was no changes? Overall, when you look at the entire continent, there was a slight improvement with 11 countries scoring higher than in the previous year. And then about 9 or so countries receiving score declines and 34 countries not changing in particular. What does this mean for our continent? What it means is that out of our 1.4 something billion people on this continent, only 7% of them, 7%, live in countries that are designated as free. 50% of the population in the 25 countries that we assessed live in countries that are actually not free. It shows you that there's a lot that we can do to improve. The rest are somewhere in the middle. In 2022, we saw notable declines in Burkina Faso, which received a negative 23 score, largest score decline on the continent. Why? There were 2 military coups in Burkina Faso, which actually eliminated all the gains that we'd seen from 2014 and the 2014 political transition that took place in that country. The coup essentially sidelined electoral bodies, accountability mechanisms, and exacerbated a security crisis in which the Islamist militant activities displaced millions of people, Burkinabes, from that country. But let me say that Burkina Faso, as we've also heard over the past week, is not actually an outlier when it comes to coups. We had coup attempts in 2022 in Guinea-Bissau, the Gambia, Sao Tome and Principe, amongst others, and Principe. The second decline was in Tunisia. And I think someone mentioned Tunisia a few days ago. The ongoing efforts by President Said to dismantle the country's democratic institutions and consolidate his own power are what led to this particular decline that we saw. We saw the president in 2021, because these things don't always happen over a year. We see the gradual erosion of rights over many, many years. And I think the 50-year report really shows us those trends. I'm really sorry today I didn't bring my PowerPoint presentation, because I think you would have been able to see just how over 50 years in some countries we've seen that gradual tailing off when it comes to human rights and democracy. So he introduced measures in 2021 where he dismissed the prime minister and suspended parliament before then going ahead to dissolve parliament in March 2022. Essentially, President Said kind of undertook a coup, a silent coup. And that's what led to the significant decline in the score in Tunisia. Very quickly, I'll also point out other countries. I'm not going to speak to all of them. Ethiopia, of course, saw a decline in score because of the war in Tigray, which has now there's been a truce, but in 2022, we saw displacements, we saw killings, we saw war crimes and crimes against humanity, according to the UN Committee of Human Rights on Ethiopia. We saw a crackdown on freedom of expression more generally across the country, so not just in the Tigray region, and we saw independent media and journalists being attacked by the authorities in Ethiopia. I will also mention Sierra Leone, because it had an election a few months ago, if it's not a month ago. But in 2022, Sierra Leone saw a 2-point decline as well, due to the ruling party's actual improper influence over the voter registration process, the redrawing of electoral boundaries, and the violent crackdown on demonstrations by the police. But like I said, it's not all doom and gloom. There were some improvements in score in places such as, interestingly enough, because Kenya is once again seeing protests. But in 2022, the elections that were held there for the first time were the most peaceful elections that we saw in Kenya in a while. We saw that there was increased transparency, fresh evidence of judicial independence, and a peaceful handover of power at that time from one political bloc to another. But things move fast. So I'm talking about 2022 here. Let me emphasize that. The improvement was in 2022. There was another improvement in scores in the small kingdom country of Lesotho, which for the first time, after a lot of political fragility and political changes in government, saw a 3-point increase because its elections actually led to a peaceful transition of power to a new party, which essentially highlights the strength of electoral politics. We still have concerns in Lesotho because civil liberties continue to be affected in that country. It's still a fragile state. There's a lot of securitization in Lesotho, but it was a positive trajectory in 2022 because of the peaceful transition of power during elections there. I also flagged some of the big guns, even though there was no changes in their score. South Africa, which in 1994, following the end of apartheid and peaceful elections there that saw the ANC government come into power, was designated as free and has been free ever since. But a word of caution in South Africa. The deeply entrenched corruption that we've seen in that country that has led to widening inequalities, crime and inefficiencies and misgovernance makes South Africa one of those countries that we are paying particular attention to and monitoring very closely because its democracy is showing signs of fragility. And so I wanted to flag that South Africa remains a free country. Its score did not change fundamentally, but this is one of those countries where you can start to see things changing in the future if those problems are not addressed. Nigeria. So we were scoring Nigeria before the elections that took place. Nigeria is designated as partly free in our Freedom in the World report. There was no change in the past year, but I thought I should flag it because at the time ahead of elections, we saw the passage of important electoral reforms, but the implementation and enforcement of those electoral reforms remained to be seen. And then when we saw the elections come out, there were significant flaws in those elections. And there were acts of violence. But this score was made in 2022 before the elections had taken place. And we saw that there were some improvements in terms of how Nigeria was going about with its election reforms. But of course, Nigeria remained problematic when it came to physical security, right? So physical security worsened, particularly in Abuja, where we saw banditry, kidnapping, and terrorism, which threatened the physical security of citizens. So let me kind of start to wrap this up a little bit and just give you some high kind of level lessons that we can draw from what we saw on the continent over the past year. So whilst I mentioned Burkina Faso and Tunisia, which had the greatest declines, as countries that were really problematic, I should highlight that most of our governments and so many of our countries remain trapped by political systems that facilitate the long-standing rule of authoritarian regimes whilst trying to box out political challenges and political challengers. So in our Freedom in the World report for 2023, 16 countries in Africa received a score of 0 on the indicator that measures political opposition. What does that mean? It means that a third of the region's countries lack the space for opposition parties to gain power through elections. And that is crucial. Repressing political challenges has become one way for authoritarians to tighten their grip on power. And we have to mention this. Again, something that the elders have been grappling with and have mentioned themselves. 5 African heads of state on this continent have been in power for more than 3 decades. And then more than half a dozen of them have been in power for at least 10 years. Again, that tells you a lot about the state of democracy on our continent. A number of the countries that we are rating as not free on the continent have also spent at least some time in the partly free band over the past 50 years since we started reporting. But there are also some countries that have never left the not free category since their first Freedom in the World analysis. These ones include the entrenched autocracies of Equatorial Guinea, Rwanda, and then the protracted conflicts, South Sudan, Somalia, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Those have remained in that category because of their ongoing situations. We have also seen setbacks and slowdowns in Burundi, the Republic of Congo, Zimbabwe. There was some promise. We've seen promises, some promise over the years. But then later saw those status improvements reversing. We've also seen backsliding recently in Benin, in Senegal, although to his credit, Macky Sall decided not to run for a 3rd term. But that has led to a drop for Senegal and Benin from free to partly free in terms of status. Mali was rated free in 1995, but has been rocked by military coups, rebel insurgencies in 2012, and that pulled it back into the not free category. So, as you can see, democracy is very, very fragile, and it's always easy to slip back and to regress back into authoritarianism and autocracies. So, let me conclude with some lessons. One of them is elections. We always talk about elections as not being the end-all and be-all of democracy. But one of the things we can say is that they remain a cornerstone of democracy. The elections in Kenya were key. Elections in Lesotho were key. Elections that took place in Zambia in 2021 saw huge changes in that country because of the changes in power that led to changes in policies as well. So elections remain a cornerstone in terms of democracy. And we have to flag upcoming elections in Zimbabwe, in Liberia in October, Zimbabwe August, the Democratic Republic of Congo in December, because these elections remain pivotal for democracy in those 3 particular countries that are flagged. And we expect from what we've seen and what we've been monitoring in those countries that these elections are likely to be contested, internally controlled, or possibly marred by violence. And we'll see kind of the results of that in the next report that we release for 2023 in 2024. Overall, I think over the past 5 decades, and this has been confirmed by Afrobarometer, the people in every region, including Africa, demand that there must be democracy. They have sought to build democracies even under the most extreme and difficult circumstances. The evidence shows that once fully established, most democratic systems are able to stand strong against a variety of challenges. Which is why when they're in that free category, even though some remain fragile, if the institutions are strong, they are unlikely to slip into being partly free or not free. Consolidated democracies where political rights and civil liberties have been secured continue to endure in this dangerous world that we are now living in. And more than anything else, 5 decades of freedom in the world demonstrate that the demand for freedom is universal, and that the years have shown that popular challenges to authoritarian rule are a recurring theme even in the most repressive of societies. So I'll end on that note. It's a very positive note. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We will now open it to the floor. I'm personally curious about something that is often said maybe in passing. I'm curious to hear what Freedom House thinks about the claim that countries like Uganda have too much nutritious, cheap, and abundant food, and that is why we are not very active when it comes to demanding for for holding our leaders accountable, that we have too much food, and that protests have happened in places where there is drought, famine, and so on. I'd like to hear what you think about that. So for now, my colleague Tessa and I will be moving around with mics to take questions. We'll start with Evans here.
Good morning. I'm Kenyan. I am interested in knowing what informed the categorization of Kenya or Kenya's judiciary as independent, and that our elections and indeed the country as peaceful, because from where I sit, peace is not denoted by absence of violence. Kenya is in a constant state of flux in terms of potential violence. We always have daggers drawn. So what informed the categorization of Kenya as peaceful and our judiciary, especially under the current Chief Justice, as judicially independent?
Let Evans introduce himself.
The people demand to know you. They want to vote for you.
I don't like politicians. I don't need to be voted for. My name is Ogada. I'm a lawyer from Kenya.
Deus, are you satisfied? Okay. Tessa?
Raise the hand.
Questions, comments? Okay, I'll come to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tuluman. I'm from South Africa. I wanted to ask, so you mentioned that some of the things that were considered as some of the civil liberties was, for example, freedom of expression, autonomy, and association. But I do want to ask, since you are an NPO, as I forgot the name of the organization already, I'm so sorry. But did you consider activist repression when it comes to freedom of expression? Because this is something that is experienced by human rights defenders across the board in Africa. You know, they are experienced in the form of slap suits, surveillance, and actual violence towards their bodies. I know, like I've heard from my networks with activists from Kenya, that people literally disappear. In South Africa, you get arrested or you slapped with a lawsuit that can go on and on and on and on, all in the name of sort of suppressing you and your expression. Are these the kinds of things that were considered? Also, secondly, when we come to autonomy and freedom of association also, I know that, I'm sorry to say this, but Africa is quite a very homophobic continent. And so were these some of the things that were considered, in that the right to express yourself in the form of queerness is also something that has been suppressed in the African continent a lot. And then lastly, women and development. I feel this is something that a lot of African countries are still lacking in. We don't see a lot of women in parliamentary spaces or generally political spaces. We also don't see women in spaces that, like in strategic positions, basically. And those that are there are sort of captured or have been co-opted as a way to say, yeah, we are developing and we are doing this, but we know that they're not actually the ones that are deciding for themselves, for lack of a better term. Thank you.
There was a hand here.
Thank you so much for the presentation. My name is Mwela Wanga from Zambia. And I think my question to the presenter would be, don't you think we are trying, especially as an African continent? We've been independent for about 50 years. Democracy on the continent is only about probably 30 years plus. Don't you think we are trying, regardless the major challenges I think we might be having? In comparison, I think Zambia recently, we hosted the Summit for Democracy, and some of the things that were discussed is that democracy on the African continent might be, I think it's not only fragile on the African continent, it's fragile across the world. You know, so for Africa, don't you think we are trying? I'll give an example of my country. When President Kenneth Kaunda lost, he freely handed over power to President Chiluba. When President Rupia Banda lost, he freely handed over power to President Michael Chilusha Sata. When President Edgar Chagwa Lungu recently lost in the 2021 general elections, he freely handed over power to President Hakainde Hichilema. So I think to some degree, don't you think the African continent is trying to at least strengthen and advance the fabric of democracy on the continent?
Hello?
Yeah, Chris, your question has raised interest here.
Yeah.
So let me take this question and I'll come to the back.
Hello? Yeah. Yeah. I'm Khalifa Saidi and I'm from Tanzania. So much has been happening in Tanzania since March 2021. And I was really looking forward to hear from Madam what does her organization found out about Tanzania. And I tried to listen very attentively, but I haven't heard her saying anything about, you know, the reforms that have been happening in Tanzania and what does the Freedom House think about what is going on in Tanzania. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much. My question lies in the issue of terminologies, which we use mostly in Africa. I think they are literally causing some problems in the way we discuss matters. For example, when we call the competing forces in the political arena for political rights, we call them opposition parties. Is that not having an impact? Who are they opposing? And who is opposing who in this? In actual fact, they need to be renamed as better parties. For example, we have other policies which like PEE, Black Economic Empowerment. Who is being black and what is that blackening in the scenario of the economies? I understand one of the leaders, the presidents who were here yesterday, they said democracy is constituted by economic development and economic empowerment. We must remove some prefixes which we put for they create structural ambiguities in our discussions, because we are excluding other people in the economies where we are staying, because we have blacks and whites and we only talk of black when it comes to empowerment. Then what is happening to that one who is not being empowered? Because we remember in our economies there are some whites who are already citizens by naturalizations, despite the fact that we were talking of colonization previously. But later on, there were some who were born within our economies who are not involved for their father's sins. Therefore, where are we accommodating them? Thank you so much.
Okay. There's a question there, but let's pause. Yes. And she'll take those, and then we'll come back.
So we'll pause first.
Yes.
So we'll pause first for a response, and then...
Okay. Great.
I'm Dr. Medicine Magocha. I'm working in South Africa at Walter Sisulu University, but originally I'm born and bred in Zimbabwe.
Thank you, everyone, for those questions. Let me start from the top. What informed the categorization of Kenya's judiciary as independence and the country as peaceful? Let me clarify. I did not categorize the country as peaceful. I didn't. I said that Kenya's elections were relatively peaceful when they took place in 2022, and that it signified an improvement from the violence that we'd seen in previous elections. So there's a lot of nuance there. The same thing with the judicial decisions. I think, yes, I think that is subject to disagreement in terms of the role of the judiciary and the role that it played and how independent it was in making those decisions. But when you look at overall the improvements in Kenya, we had to give them an increase because we looked at the electoral process and how it took place, and it showed that there had been significant improvements. And so I really want to emphasize this in terms of how we score these, that even countries that we designate as free does not mean that they are subject to political freedoms in their entirety and that they are perfect. No. It just means that comparatively, when you look at them across the board within the region, they are actually subject to greater improvements and higher scores than those who are not free and those that are partly free. So there's a lot of, I think, nuances that we need to unpack when we do this scoring. And if you look at our reports and if you read the country, because each of these countries has a detailed kind of summary about why we scored them that way. So I just wanted to really say, my brother, I take your note about the judiciary, but I do think that there was an improvement in Kenya in terms of how elections took place in 2022. Yes, ma'am, we do consider all the issues that you highlighted, whether it's repression against activists, surveillance, LGBTI rights are factored in under the personal autonomy and individual rights categories. So all those things that you mentioned in terms of violations are considered in this score. And again, if you look at our report online, you see the details. Don't you think Africa is trying regardless of the major challenges? Yes, and I think that's why I was really kind of emphasizing that it's not all doom and gloom, that there are improvements. We've seen growth since the 1990s when we started reporting. And that's why I talked about South Africa as an example. I talked about democratization as being fragile, but at the same time, you can see growth. And those countries that do democratize rarely slip back into the not free category. And that's the same for Africa. The challenge for us is that we have very few countries that are in that particular category. And we have a lot that are in the partly free category that are likely to slip back into being not free. And we see very little improvements in terms of countries moving from partly free to free. So I think, again, it's a lot of nuance to unpack there about how that happens. Tanzania, yes. So I didn't mention Tanzania, not because I didn't want to mention it, it's just that there were so many countries. And I also didn't want to turn this into a debate about Tanzania because we are in Tanzania. Tanzania actually in 2022 saw a 2-point increase. Tanzania is designated as being partly free. We saw improvements in terms of civil society making gains and a reduction of tensions with opposition parties. I'm going to get into trouble for saying opposition here, but yes. So we saw that President Samia Hassan really kind of worked to open up the space for civil society and to open up the space for civic activism. And so we do note that in our report on Tanzania, and there was a 2-point increase in terms of designation, but it remains in the partly free category. Now, on the use of terminology, my brother, I don't think I have an easy answer for you. That is the terminology that is common. We don't just use it in Africa. We speak about opposition parties across the globe. Whether there's a debate about how we should designate parties, political parties, what we should say there, that's another question, and I don't think it's a question for me to answer in this particular space, except to say that the terminology we use is terminology that is commonly used, and I spoke about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is where we kind of anchor our methodology and the terms that we use for our reports. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Abdou Aziz Sissé. I'm from Senegal. Thanks, Mrs. Kasambala, for your intervention of this, large state of democracy in Africa. So what I want to highlight is the case for Senegal. Since yesterday, everybody is mentioned the declaration of the president to avoid for a third term. So we magnify and we applaud for this, for this declaration, but we don't have to forget that it's not for his political will. There was a pressure local pressure and international pressure in order to, to let him to know that he can't run for a third term according to the constitution and according to his former declarations. And right now there are so many people who are persecuted. There are so many prisoners due to political offenses. There are almost or more than 500 prisoners, and there is one I want to let you know that he is a raper. He's in the prison for more than 6 months. I just wanted to to let you know that his renunciation for the third term is not only for his political lead, but there is a large pressure from the Senegalese people, from a largest coalition of civil societies, trade unions, and political parties called the F24, which put a pressure to him in order to let him know that the Senegalese people or the African people as a whole don't want president to be in power, for a long term. That's why I wanted to share this point. Thanks.
Thank you. For the benefit of the rapporteuring team, please share your name.
Abdou Aziz Sise.
Thank you very much for that presentation. My name is Bernadette French from Sierra Leone. And I'll just like to probably spotlight some of the very dooming reports that we get from the region in terms of democratic backsliding, but using that as well against some of the very successful interventions and advocacy that we have seen over time. And I think from my perspective, I think we need to also celebrate the small wins in terms of the very, very efficient and effective role that civil society has played over time in terms of raising our voices against oppression and authoritarianism in the region. As I speak, my colleague from Nigeria and from Cameroon would attest to the fact that I currently live in exile in Accra as a result of the position we took in the just concluded elections in Sierra Leone. And because, again, with respect to the fraudulent elections results that we saw. But in the midst of that, I think for us, I think we have to anchor our advocacy and our activism in hope, because we have been talking about intergenerational dialogue and handing over. We cannot pass on pessimism to the future generation. So I think much of what we're doing links again with social movements. So some of the lessons that we bring into this is how do we build movements across countries? How do we build alliance and solidarity across the continent? Because we have seen what's happening in the African Union, we've seen what's happening in ECOWAS. Our leaders are persistent in their strive to remain in power, and they would use all tools of oppression to do that. So I think the future and the answer is civil society, and how we mobilize across country and across continent to do that is critical.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mutemi Kiama from Kenya. I'd like to echo my colleague, lawyer, actually, about a country that is very good at shaping narratives, how the world perceives it. We brought in Cambridge Analytica even before Donald Trump did in 2013 to shape the perceptions from elections. We've had them in 2017 and of course, Cambridge Analytica went down, and of course, other similar organizations came along. What is, I don't know whether, I've been asking this question, I don't know whether the definition we're discussing here, because I come from Kenya. In the last, yesterday, during the demonstrations around the illegitimacy of the election that you've largely declared free, over 50 people were shot by the police as they were protesting over the cost of living. Of course, you know, the leader of opposition in Tanzania was shot 16 times. I don't know how he survived. That guy must have... Right now, if you go on his Twitter, you will see, despite the so-called truce, he's talking about attempts to arrest him. So what are we, I mean, what criteria are we using? I really don't understand what you're talking about.
Thank you very much to lobby for effective transformation. And yet we see freedom platforms, the exclusion of women voices in leadership and empowerment, and yet they are 51% of the majority and continue to be excluded. What are the implications? And then secondly, we heard one of the head of state saying that some leadership are entitled because of their liberation backgrounds, and yet you commented that electoral processes remains hugely influential in bringing democracy. How can then, in Africa, in view of many people who have been in exile, who have been marginalized, and faced difficult situation, how can elections in Africa be an accountable process, be a process where independent electoral process are not manipulated so that this change becomes meaningful, because we continuously see that the electoral processes are fraud?
We have time for a few more questions. Yes, please ask. Okay, here.
Good morning. I am Rami, assistant professor of political science at Cairo University. Thank God you did not mention Egypt, so we are clean. Basically, I teach human rights and democracy in Cairo University, and we usually tell our students to handle the Freedom House Index critically, because actually for us it's more than a report, it's not just a report. And we usually try to focus on the politics of this report. In your opinion, how do these reports inform the American foreign policy towards Africa, in your opinion, or in your knowledge? Because actually the problematic issue that we are here, we are voicing complaints, but at the end of the day, this report is taken seriously by the American foreign policy. So how do these reports end up as a kind of policy directions for the United States? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Jimmy Spire Sentongo from Uganda. I would want to hear the examples of countries that are listed as free. I know the list is too long, but maybe you could mention a few. I only know Uganda in that category. What are the others?
Merci beaucoup. Je suis Lucie Boileau de la République centrafricaine. Je vous ai suivi avec beaucoup d'intention. Et j'en profite aussi pour vous féliciter pour votre présentation.
Please wait for her to wear translation. Channel 1 for English. Channel 1. Yes, please.
Merci beaucoup. Je disais que j'étais Lucie Boileau de la République centrafricaine. Je suis de la société civile, activiste de droits de l'homme. J'ai écouté votre présentation avec beaucoup d'attention. J'en profite aussi pour vous féliciter. Mais ma question est celle-ci, parce que vous avez cité beaucoup de pays qui sont paisible et libre. Je n'ai pas écouté parler de la République centrafricaine, surtout en ce moment où se passe beaucoup de choses. Hein, on est un peu perturbé, on a de la crampe au ventre parce qu'il y a des responsables des institutions qui sont relevés de leur poste. Il y a la réécriture de la Constitution. Nous sommes en train de passer au référendum. Il y a la brouille du côté des partis politiques et il y a la restriction de l'espace civique. Alors, moi, je saurais comment classer la République centrafricaine par rapport à tout ce qui se passe en ce moment. Alors, si vous pouvez vraiment nous aider à comprendre un peu, est-ce que nous respectons la démocratie? Est-ce que nous sommes dans quel type de démocratie on essaie de monnayer le pouvoir du peuple par de l'argent? Alors, voilà ma question. Je vous remercie.
Bonjour l'assistance. Moi, je viens du Niger. Mon nom, c'est Hamani Assouman. Je suis défenseur des droits humains au Niger. J'ai suivi avec intérêt en tout cas, la présentation du rapport de Freedom. Et je profite pour vous féliciter sincèrement. Nous faisons le même travail de monitoring au Niger par rapport à tout ce qui concerne en tout cas le traitement de l'espace civique, la vie démocratique, un peu partout, surtout au Sahel. C'est là où j'attendais de pied ferme tout au long de ce rapport. Je n'ai pas entendu parler du Sahel, les cas du Sahel qui traversent aujourd'hui une sorte de pathologie de la démocratie. Je le disais hier en panel, au niveau de notre panel, je le disais tantôt qu'aujourd'hui le Sahel est presque abandonné. Qu'est-ce que je parle à la communauté internationale? Aujourd'hui, il y a 3 pays en tout cas du Sahel qui traversent des crises démocratiques. Ou disons, je ne parle pas au nom de ces pays, mais c'est pour un peu généraliser. Vous voyez aujourd'hui les cas du Mali, les cas de la Guinée, les cas du Burkina, et même chez moi au Niger. Non, mais par contre, au Niger, ça va encore parce qu'on a pu avoir une alternance démocratique. Et là, je disais même en panel hier aux gens que je profite pour faire un plaidoyer pour mon ancien président qui a décidé librement de quitter le pays et en tout cas le pouvoir aujourd'hui pour être, en tout cas, il y a une alternance pour la première fois, une alternance pacifique au Niger qui a connu depuis l'indépendance 4, 5 à 6 coups d'État. Donc vraiment pour revenir au cas du Sahel, j'étais en train de dire que le Sahel traverse aujourd'hui une crise, une chose qu'on appelle la pathologie de la démocratie. Je m'attendais à voir un peu par rapport à ces cas-ci, en termes de généralité, qu'est-ce qui se passe. Parce qu'aujourd'hui, il y a une autre, en deuxième position, il y a une autre crise qui est là au Sahel, c'est ce qu'on appelle le terrorisme, le djihadisme. Sous couvert de la lutte contre le terrorisme, aujourd'hui, nous constatons qu'il y a une sorte de rétrécissement de l'espace civique au Sahel. Les États profitent pour émettre des normes, pour émettre des lois et qui rétrécissent l'espace civique. Aujourd'hui, nous ne pouvons pas manifester dans certains pays. Nous ne pouvons pas, en tout cas, travailler en association en toute liberté. Donc, j'étais en train de dire que nous aurions souhaité voir quelque part, en tout cas, quelque chose qui, en tout cas, par rapport à ces rapports, puisque ces rapports de Freedom concernent toute l'Afrique, et je m'attendais à ce que le Sahel soit, en tout cas, quelque chose soit dit par rapport au Sahel. Qu'est-ce que vous en pensez de façon, en tout cas, pour conclure, je voudrais savoir qu'est-ce que vous en pensez, ou votre rapport, qu'est-ce que votre rapport en dit par rapport à ces cas-ci. Merci.
Thank you for the presentation.
Okay, this will be the second last round, and then we'll have a final one, because there's people who, I think it's a good thing that your presentation has elicited this much feedback. So, okay, so let's hear these questions. Then you can answer after this one, and then we'll do a final round.
Okay, so I wanted to ask broadly about the methodological approach that Freedom House uses. There is a charity in the UK that recently decided to dissolve itself after concluding that traditional philanthropy is basically a function of colonial capitalism. So I just wanted to give this as a background to ask the question around the methodology. So you stated at the beginning that your work is in some ways anchored in the values and ideas that are espoused in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we know is adopted in 1948 at the time when the absolute majority of African countries are under colonialism, and the language, the discourse that's enunciated in that document were developed as part of colonialism. And we are at a time when there is a lot of reflection and rethinking about some of these key methodologies and frameworks that we use to understand our own problems, predicaments, and also to come up with solutions. And one of those is around the need to decolonize and find new and bold ways of addressing these problems. And I was just wondering, given the significant work that you do across the world and the legitimacy and credibility that you have, I think, built up over the course of time, whether there is any thinking within Freedom House about the continued use of this predominantly Western methodologies to look at African countries who have radically different experiences, challenges, histories, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you. Please take those and then we'll do the final round.
Thank you so much. I think a very broad range of questions. Some of them were more or less comments and updates. Let me begin by saying that I obviously did not speak to each and every one of the countries that we made assessments of. So we did make assessments in the 54 countries on the continent. And if you really want to follow up on what we said about your country, please go to our website, the Freedom House website. The report is there, and there's a lot of details for each country. There just wasn't enough time. So I could have spoken about Senegal or Egypt or Central African Republic, but I just thought I would spotlight some countries. And I know that when you start honing in on countries, it can become a bit of a controversial issue, and it's fine. And I think that's the whole point of it, really, right? The second point I also wanted to make about evidence and data. It's constantly changing. We're constantly refining our methodology. And I think feedback in terms of how we go about doing this is very, very important. So that's why I always want to talk and engage, because this is the type of feedback that I go back to the research team with and say, you know, these are some of the points that have been made. How can we refine the methodology that we're using? I want to emphasize that it's done with great rigor. These kind of assessments are not done lightly, because we do know that they do influence policies in various spaces. They are designed to show a snapshot of what's going on in the world, where the challenges lie, and where there are improvements, and what can be done. So it's an important tool for use by policymakers, and we know that. So we approach this with great intellectual rigor. I also wanted to say that the broader assessment of what democracy actually means is a challenge for all of us in the room. And it's not something that can be addressed solely by an INGO such as Freedom House. But certainly we use the method of, we usually use the term electoral democracies, and then look at, under political rights, countries that have scored above 20. So we look at minimum standards for how we can designate a country as an electoral democracy or not. Again, that remains, I think, subject to challenges, subject to discussion, and again, we remain open to the broader discussions around democracy, what it means for Africa, what it means to Africa, and what its impact is. But at the same time, I also wanted to add that the evidence sometimes speaks for itself. There's a reason why I spoke to some of these leaders that have been sitting as heads of state for 30 years. Some of this evidence, colleagues, cannot be disputed. And we should not sit here and lie to ourselves when we can see the evidence in front of us. So some of the evidence, yes, can be questioned, can be analyzed. We need to interrogate our work. But some stuff just can't be disputed. So I take note of the gentleman from Senegal who gave me, I think, a lot of background about what's been happening in Senegal. And I think that is noted, that the political situation in Senegal is nowhere near, you know, being what we would say as a democracy. Where we're going and where Senegal is going remains open to interrogation. It's key that we look at institutions as well and the pressure at play, because I think that is very telling that international pressure led to Macky Sall not going for a third term. And that's the whole point of it, right? International pressure should be brought to bear when leaders seek to unconstitutionally change their term limits. My sister said we need to celebrate the small wins. I totally agree. It's very important that we do celebrate the small wins and the big wins, because those are the ones that we are aiming for. We want to see the wins. We celebrated the wins in Sudan several years ago, when the pro-democracy movements and the young people came out in the streets and al-Bashir was overthrown. That was noted in our Freedom in the World report. But look where we are now. So we have to point out when the wins are there, but we also have to point out that we have issues and we have problems. And the elders have acknowledged that on this continent, we do have issues, we do have challenges. We also present this report to other parts. So it's not just Africa. We go to Europe, and we're equally as challenged. People push back and say, well, you know, what you're saying about Hungary is wrong. What you're saying about that country is wrong. And I think then we engage again. So we are pushing back. We've spoken about US democracy. In the past 2-3 years, I think our report has really emphasized the regression in democracy in the US. And there's been discussion, robust discussion about whether the US should be designated as being free or partly free. And again, very good and important discussions that are taking place around the state of democracy around the world. My brother had a very important question. I liked your question around the methodology that we use and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as being something that was anchored at a time when a lot of countries were still colonized. I think language is important, and I totally agree. I think within Freedom House, we're having these debates about what decolonization actually is, what it means from a continental perspective, what it means for democracy, what it means for how we designate countries. Those are important debates that have to be had. And those of us who sit here from the continent as an African sitting in an international NGO, one of my roles is to also throw that kind of debate within the organization and say, what are we doing? How are we assessing this? But at the same time, I have to tell you this. Even as I look at the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, I see the qualities and the values that it perpetuates and that speaks to as being universal. And so, in my opinion, I think the Universal Declaration of Human Rights remains just as relevant in terms of the language and values of democracy and freedoms that are the proponents of this, that are in the declaration itself. I think they remain key. So I would argue that it's still something that we need to use, and these tools are still there, although we can start to redefine some of the language that has been used in these declarations. Finally, Sahel crisis. You see, that's why when you ask 10 questions, Sahel crisis, yes, my brother. The Sahel crisis has been a big one, and we've been reporting in our various Freedom in the World reports. 2021, if you read that one, you see there's a huge emphasis on the coups, on the insurgencies, and the instability and insecurity in the Sahel region. In Guinea, we spoke to what was happening in Burkina Faso. I think I also highlighted Burkina Faso as one of the countries that saw the biggest decline in 2022. So yes, it remains a focus for us, and we will continue to monitor and report on developments in that region. Thank you, Andrew. I hope there are no more questions.
You have 4 more questions. People who will hang me if I don't give them. But now there are 6. Good heavens. 4. I promise we will get back to those who had not raised their hands before. So I'll start with the bishop here. 2, 3.
I have the microphone.
Who has
left me with the microphone?
Okay, you got me. 30 seconds, please.
Yes, thank you so much. Really, mine is a curious one. You talked about the 5 countries where the heads of state have been there for 30 years, and another 11 where they've been there for more than 10 years. And so I'm tempted to ask whether, when we are measuring democracy, we are looking at it along a continuum in terms that one can be on the other extreme and another one on the other side. And whether it's not about time that for those that are more than 30 years, they actually dropped off from the measurements of democracy. Because I'm really wondering why, when we are measuring, we even have the confidence to mention that these other 5 have been here for 30 years.
Thank you, Arinda. Sir?
Yes. Oh, thank you very much. I want to consider everything said here, and congratulations, madam, for a brilliant presentation. I will be back. I'm Eric Ndushabanda. I'm a professor of political science at Université Catholique de Louvain and in Rwanda as well, and active in think tanks and research as well. You said commonly used methodology inspired by this declaration. I salute all comments about methodology, and my question is, as we're presenting Africa findings, I think we have a right to ask and to question really the way we do things. And I'm an international consultant. I've been trying some indicators of OECD in Rwanda and in Congo and in South Africa. The shift of methodology is really refusing to fit in. Second is about the qualitative part of things. Why do we consider still democracy from electoral processes and repressions and numbering them? But what we are intending here is to see democracy from below. What is going on in the mind of people? Decentralization, access to service, women, youth, people inclusive. And this is the case of Rwanda, for example. I know this is a hard part of politics. It is very hard to talk about this with our background in Rwanda. But when we go down, business environment, access to service delivered to digital spaces, we don't need anymore to face people. What is democracy at the end of the day? Thank you.
Thank you very much. You have 30 seconds as well.
Bonjour tout le monde. Merci madame. Merci madame pour votre brillant exposé. Je voudrais intervenir sur 3 points, si vous me le permettez. D'abord, vous avez fait un tableau noir sur la situation démocratique en Afrique, parmi lesquels vous avez classé les pays dont ce sont les plus mal notés. Malheureusement, vous n'avez pas fait allusion sur le cas des Comores que je représente ici, alors que vous savez que la situation n'est pas aussi paisible dans la mesure où une partie du territoire comorien, qui est l'île de Mayotte, qui est reconnue par les Nations Unies suivant 14 résolutions, sur ce territoire, plus tous les Africains qui s'y trouvent sont maltraités, torturés et expulsés par la puissance coloniale. Une telle situation n'a pas été évoquée sur ce plateau. Ça, c'est un premier point. Le deuxième point, comme vous le savez, l'Union des Comores compte organiser des élections dans 6 mois et qu'il y en avait eu en 2016 lesquelles ont été controverses. Alors, je voudrais savoir aujourd'hui, à travers votre analyse, quels sont les mécanismes ou propositions que vous comptez nous proposer pour améliorer justement la situation des 16 pays les plus mal notés. Et un dernier point, madame, vous avez parlé des chefs d'État qui se sont maintenus au pouvoir pendant plus de 10 ans et que d'autres cherchent à se maintenir pendant 2 décennies. Quels sont votre point de vue par rapport, quels sont les facteurs clés que vous avez constatés et quelles sont les solutions que vous nous proposez? Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup. There was a question here. Where's the bishop?
Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Maria Kisumbi. I love the discussion because it has really created debate, provoked thought. I love the discussion around the methodology and decolonizing. So my request is to the conveners is, I challenge you all, the conveners especially, next year we want the State of Democracy report produced by the Africa Drive for Democracy Conference, and then we debate it. We define what our methodology is as Africans. We define how we want democracy to be measured and tracked, because those are some of the action points we put. So this is my challenge to the conveners. Why not? State of Africa Democracy report produced by Africa Drive for Democracy.
I'm sorry, I'm not coming to the back. I'm ending with 1, 2, and 3. We have to switch to another session. Go.
All right, thank you very much. My name is Rotimi. I'm from Nigeria. I'm going also back to the conversation around your methodology. I'm looking at information from Wikipedia, and it says the US government is funding Freedom House 86% in 2016. I don't know the current figures now. And my question is about the classification of the US as free, and if it has ever been classified anything other than free. And this is also some of the conversations that we should continue to ask. How are you transparent with your funding? Where's it coming from? And how are you avoiding conflict of interest in the way that you classify the US and other Western organizations? Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I will speak in French. Donc je me présente, je suis Soumaïa Abdallah de la Tunisie, je suis étudiante et chercheur en master de droit et politique de l'Union africaine. Vous avez évoqué, madame, le cas de la Tunisie pour le président Kais Saied. Donc moi je voulais vous demander, donc le président justement il argumentait ses actes par le fait qu'il soit démocratiquement élu. Et donc son argument c'est la démocratie. Donc je voulais vous demander si la démocratie ici pour la Tunisie ne présente pas, ou en général ne présente pas un inconvénient parce qu'on peut la détourner facilement. Merci.
Merci. Je suis
de l'ONG Changement Social Bénin, chargé des droits de l'homme. Je suis vraiment un peu confus de l'appréciation générale et des interventions. Et du coup, je voudrais aussi faire une suggestion en fait, à l'organisation pour les prochaines fois. C'est qu'on puisse s'accorder sur certains fondamentaux. Parce que parlant des droits humains, est-ce que nous sommes tous en fait universalistes à travers les valeurs et principes portés par certains instruments? Nous sommes généralement habitués à Changement Social Bénin à pratiquer les mécanismes, que ce soit onusiens comme africains. Et nous savons, si nous sommes vraiment humanistes, l'essentiel que chacun de nous pourrait tirer de ces instruments. Je pense qu'il faut vraiment qu'on fasse le débat sur l'universalité de certains principes et valeurs. À partir de là, on pourrait peut-être adhérer au contenu du rapport. Sinon, vous aurez assez de questions sur la méthodologie, et je comprends, parce que les fondamentaux, on n'est pas forcément d'accord sur ça. Voilà.
Thank you, Tiseke, for good presentation. I'm Loveness from Malawi. So for me, I want to understand some of the challenges that you face when we are doing the research, because it could have been also better if you have highlighted some of the challenges that you face when you are doing the research. And the other thing is that as African, we are good at finding the problems, but to implement it, that's another challenge. So on your own words, what can you say, or what can it be done to implement the problems that we have found? Thank you.
This is the last question.
Thank you. My name is Pilile Mavuso from Eswatini. I just want to ask, though I haven't read much about the report, about the situation that is happening in the country, where we see most our people being assassinated, being butchered, being tortured, and nothing is happening. And in 2 weeks, in two months down the line, we'll be having elections, and nothing is being done. While we have most of the reports being circulating about what is happening in the country, the internet is being shut down, no freedom of expression, no freedom of speech, no freedom of associations. Political parties are banned, but still we are categorized as part of Africans, and we need that democracy. Actually, they're even detoxing the information, telling us that we are a free monarchical democracy. We don't know what the definition of that. Really, we will need the definition of what really democracy is. Thank you.
Thank you. You have earned, more than anyone, you have earned your break tea.
Thank you. I have. Let me start with the gentleman. I think the question of funding and who funds us is very important. I think it's quite transparent. As you said, you looked up Wikipedia. 90% of funding for Freedom House is US government funds. 10% is private funding. The Freedom in the World report is not funded by the US government. It comes from the 10% of private funding. So that is a fact. However, your question, I think, is very valid about how we designate countries as free. And this is what I'm saying, is that it's not a perfect process. But the US is not the only one. There's always debates around other countries that have been free for a long time, where we're seeing issues. And we've said that just because a country is designated as free does not mean it doesn't have any problems. There are issues, but the issues are not as significant as to become partly free. The US has strong institutions just like South Africa, because South Africa is another example of a country that has been free since we started reporting on it. It has strong checks and balances, strong institutions such as the judiciary, independent electoral management bodies. The rights of South Africans to protest are widely respected. So there's a whole raft of indicators where South Africa remains stable despite its big problems. The same can be said for the US. So that's my response to that question. In terms of the findings, I totally agree with you. I think there's a lot of other nuances. There's a lot of issues in terms of grassroots democracy from below. My brother, who I didn't respond to, talked about women's roles and the women, what is the role of women in leadership in promoting democracy. Those are issues that we refer to under some of the indicators, because there just wasn't enough time. It's a broad range of questions that we ask, that we look into around social movements, the rights in terms of the civic space, in terms of women's rights, in terms of gender-based violence. There's so many questions that we ask. It's a whole raft of questions that lead us to then assess and make these assessments. But of course, there's always stuff that could or may have been left out. Again, it's not a perfect methodology. Comoros, yes, I take note. I think like so many other of the other interventions, country-specific ones, I think people will always have, I think, pointers about what's happening in their countries, and I think we always love to engage in feedback. We love to get more information. We actually often speak to the embassies. When the report comes out, we have individual meetings with embassies in DC who come to us seeking to clarify some of the points that we've made, asking about how we made the scores, and we attend each and every one of those meetings, and we engage with each and every one of the embassies that request a meeting with us to ask about how we came to particular scores and particular assessments of their status. The challenges that we face in terms of doing the research, I think there's a multitude of challenges. One of them is our analysts trying to gather information and data in countries that are almost closed. So, for example, we struggle in Iran, in China, and some of the analysts are doing this work at great risk. Some of them we don't even speak. They anonymously work for us. We make sure we maintain their anonymity because they're working in very, very high-risk environments to gather that kind of information. For our continent, and I want to tie it into what my sister said in terms of our intervention, another challenge for us is getting the information and data. Some of this information, especially within, is not publicly available. So when you want data that can back it up, when you want to seek information from governments, it's not widely available. You can't just do a search and find it online. That's a big challenge as well in terms of how we gather the information and the data. And I wanted to tie it to my sister here when she said, I think it's great that we have a raft of various organizations that are collecting this type of information and coming up with these types of reports, despite as imperfect as they may be. And I would throw it back to say, yeah, I think it would be great if those resources put in to developing a homegrown Africa report that gives an assessment. I think that would be great, because then we look at all these various reports and see the way they align. And it's interesting because we're not the only ones. I think there's VDEM, my brothers from International IDEA who are also doing this type of assessment. And we see that we still broadly align, despite some of the slightly different methodologies that we use. In terms of broader alignment around democratic regression and some of the challenges we face, both globally and on the continent, there's very little difference, which does show that I think we are on the right path and we're actually collecting the most relevant and most important information that helps us make these assessments. I think in terms of, there's a lot of country-specific recommendations that I've noted. Eswatini, yes, my sister, we have the report. Please go to our website. Eswatini is designated as being not free. We have highlighted the challenges in terms of political assassinations and the violence there and the violations of human rights in Eswatini. What can we do? We also, in the report, do have recommendations about how to counter authoritarianism, how to push back against unconstitutional changes of government and coups. We have very specific recommendations that reflect on all this, so we don't just give you the information, we also come up with specific recommendations around what can be done. A lot of what was said and has been said on this forum here with the elders is exactly what we're saying in terms of addressing unconstitutional changes of government, flawed elections. You have to strengthen institutions. That's why I keep going back to institutions as being one of the key areas when you talk about designating countries as being free, partly free or not free. Our institutions are weak when it comes to elections. Our electoral management bodies are not independent. So some of those challenges are the things that we need to address in order to move. I would love to have a broader debate around democracy and what it means, because I think that's something that is fundamental, that in all these spaces, wherever I go, people ask, but what does democracy mean for us? What is democracy? And there is no general agreement, but what we must accept is that there are certain values that we are all, interested in when it comes to human rights. I'll stop there because there's lots that can be said. Thank you so much for the tough questions. Thank you for the interrogation. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that great presentation. I'm trying to juggle different things in my hands. It's very tough. So I just think there's such an important ability for us to have deep disagreement on these important issues. One of the things I often say is that if democracy is anything, it must be our ability to deeply disagree but still find ways forward. And I think that the session was part of that. And also, if yesterday's theme in my mind was whose democracy is it? I think today we're firmly in the place of what is democracy today and going forward, and who has the right to define it. And I think we must give ourselves permission to actually interrogate the whole thing. You know, I think the decline of democracy is a global thing, and the questioning of democracy is global. And it's not just in rooms like this that is being questioned. We all know in our various spaces where we work, I mean, even the examples in the US, in Brazil, is about, you know, people, community members, citizens saying, we've been in democracy, but here we are now. And the question about if democracy is working in its form is an essential one. I think we must hold that tension for as long as we can, as deeply as we can, and really push ourselves to ask, is there a way to innovate a democracy that actually delivers for the majority of African people? We've decided to do a health break now, and we're going to ask everybody to be seated again at 11 because we'd like to start the next session, the next panel session, but let's just have a stretch. Let's get some coffee. Let's, greet each other if we haven't seen each other this morning, and then sit back at 11 o'clock. Thank you.